this is Joe Perry and Steven Tyler of Aerosmith for Red. You know, it's okay to rock and roll and party down. Just don't get in that 2,000-pound bullet when you're done and cocked. And please don't drink and drive. I'm the one that jaded you.
A reminder that friends don't let friends drive drunk. A public service message brought to you by the Ad Council, U.S. Department of Transportation, National Association of Broadcasters, and RAD.
This is Time and Space, hosted by Mike Smith.
The following is a presentation of unidentified entertainment in 22nd Century Radio. Manassas, Fairfax, Washington, D.C.
Exopolitics and Ufology, Religion and Science, Time and Space. Hosted by Mike Smith.
He's liable to ask some direct questions. Give him direct answers. Tell him what you think.
There are those who believe that life here began out there, far across the universe, with tribes of humans who may have been the forefathers of the Egyptians, or the Toltecs, or the Mayans. Some believe that there may yet be brothers of man who even now fight to survive somewhere beyond the heavens.
Mr. President, in 12 hours I will destroy Washington, D.C. with this giant laser.
I want the people to know that they still have 2 out of 3 branches of the government working for them, and that ain't bad.
This is Time and Space, hosted by Mike Smith.
The clock is ticking.
You are listening to the Mike Smith Show.
You are without doubt the worst pirate I've ever heard of. But you have heard of me.
Colin Cowherd, leading the herd.
Welcome back. The United States needed to beat Egypt by at least 3 goals, while the world champion Italians had to lose to Brazil by at least 3. Astronomical odds, but it happened. And Team USA is able to stave off elimination in this Confederations Cup. They're calling it the Miracle on Sod. And USA now faces Spain next and will get pummeled. I got a bunch of emails. Drew in Bend, Oregon. Colin, you took so much pleasure in bashing USA soccer. I assume you will be singing their praises because they beat a very good Egyptian side. First of all, Egypt hasn't qualified in 19 years for the World Cup. Okay, let's stop making them the New England Patriots. This is their first Confederation Cup they've qualified for since the 90s. And we should beat Egypt. We have 305 million people. They have a fifth of that. I'm getting all sorts of emails. Hate. Patrick in Highlands Ranch. Heard I know you guys, you 45-year-old fat guys, like to kind of rip on all us youngsters that like soccer. Stop right there. First of all, I work out every day. I'm 6'2", $183. I'm not a fatty. And I appreciate soccer. I just think United States soccer fans are goofy. Listen, soccer nerd, listen carefully. I'm not saying USA soccer is Canada bad. I'm saying we're somewhere between 12th and 22nd, closer to 22nd, which is what Tommy Smith, ESPN, just acknowledged. Okay, 12th and 22nd in college football. 12th best program is Boston College. 22nd is BYU. That's not USC. That's not Oklahoma. That's not Florida. There's a huge gap between Florida athletes and BYU athletes. If BYU played Florida's schedule, they're 6-5. Florida wins a national title. BYU and their cruddy conference can go like 10-1 or 10-2. Put them in the SEC or the Big 12, or put them in a legitimate conference on the road every weekend, 150,000, 110,000 people. They're not a very good program. Okay, so I don't have anything against soccer, but, what happened over the weekend in this improbable finish so the USA squeaks in, it doesn't change the fact that the USA is somewhere between 12th and 22nd in the world. We're not Canada bad, but we're certainly closer to Canada than we are to Brazil. That's all I'm saying.
Find us on the internet, timeandspace.us and Time and Space Radio Show on Facebook.
Unfortunately, no one can be told what the Matrix is. You have to see it for yourself.
Welcome to voice print identification. When you see the red light go on, would you please state in the following order your destination, your nationality, and your full name. Surname first, Christian name, and initial.
I am just a figment of your imagination.
There will be no foolish wand-waving or silly incantations in this class.
Aren't you taking this test tomorrow?
What, the Foreign Service Board?
Yeah, sure. Well, don't you have to study?
No, are you kidding? I know the FSB exam class backwards. I've taken it 3 times already. Let me see the booklet. Look at these samples. All multiple choice, it's easy. Here. If discovered appropriating classified documents at a foreign consulate reception, you should A, express concern, B, act surprised, C, deny everything, and D, all 3. The answer is D, all 3. It's common sense stuff.
Did the environment at Azteca affect the U.S. team?
Absolutely. 3 words, home field advantage. It's why every American pro sports team works so hard in the regular season to get home field advantage. I don't like staying at people's house overnight. We all have the comforts of home. And listen, it's a very simple rule. It's hard to do your job when people are throwing stuff at you. Now, I'm a trained professional. I can talk through this and keep my concentration, even with a banana. But the reality is, in a pear, right now I'm losing my concentration. I'm slightly intimidated. I'm not sure what's going on, and I forgot what I was talking about despite all my training. Okay, the shtick is over. The bottom line, it's hard to do your job when people are throwing pears at you.
It's very difficult to do your job when a pear is being thrown at you.
Even when it's top produce, it's very difficult.
You know what? If that was urine or vomit, there's a mess all over this desk, right?
You're listening to The Mike Smith Show.
Find us on the internet, timeandspace.us. And don't forget, download our free smartphone app.
I'm all right. I'm okay. All of you people, blocking the intersection. You're all idiots.
You're the one. I am wondering, why are you here?
So I was all excited to watch Team USA take on Mexico. Oh, one problem. The game's not on television. No! NBC, which has plenty of outlets, USA Network, CNBC, MSNBC, Bravo, NBC, we're not putting it on any of them. Telemundo gets it. Oh, fantastic. So all you sophisticated soccer nerds, first time in my life I care, I'm building a bar to watch USA Mexico, and the game's not on television. We are so sophisticated. We wear backpacks. We are cultured. Yeah, you better be cultured, because you're going to have to watch it in Spanish. Ridiculous. I make love in my socks. I backpack around Europe. I'm a soccer fan. Yeah, you're very sophisticated. They invented this thing in the 40s called television. You may want to put your biggest game ever on it. Basically, I have to learn Spanish within a month to be able to follow the game. Muy caliente. The only good thing about Telemundo is all those hot weather chicks. I'm not even asking you to put the game in color. Put it in black and white. I'll pay for the cameraman to fly to Mexico. Give me one guy who can scream goal. Put it on television. Sheesh. It's embarrassing. I can get every NFL preseason game on TV. I can't get the biggest soccer game ever. NBC gives me 450,000 hours of Michael Jackson. I can't get 90 minutes of a soccer game. The biggest one in the history of the country. Unbelievable. I have to go out and buy Rosetta Stone to understand the play-by-play. I mean, can you imagine the Super Bowl coming on? And it's only carried in German. Ach, ich, Touchdown, hoch, hach, hich, Brady, ach. Ich bin Brady, touchdown, You know, you had me and you lost me, soccer. I wanted to watch the game.
You're listening to Time and Space on 22nd Century Radio.
Things liable to get a little dicey around here.
Why do you ask questions to which you already know the answers?
Neil Armstrong, 38-year-old American standing on the surface of the moon on this July 20th, 1969.
One small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
And we're live, broadcasting from suburban Washington, D.C. and cities around the globe. You're listening to Time and Space, hosted by Mike Smith. Ufology, religion, exopolitics, science, comedy, justice, motorsports, and more. Fascinating interviews with subject matter experts, authors, researchers, and celebrities. Original discussions on disclosure, world space programs, ancient history, religious texts, UFO sightings, archaeology, news and analysis, all originating just minutes from the United States Capitol. Games and prizes abound as we play Bungo. That's a fine piece of driving. What's today's date? Name all 8. Where is Daisy Bell? And how do I cook that? The show is produced by H-Town. It's his world. We're just living in it. Our executive chef is Mike Fay. The commander of our International Space Station is TK. The official rock band is Brain Fang. Please visit brainfang.com and find them on YouTube. Time and Space is always free. You can download episodes and interact with us on the World Wide Web at timeandspace.us and on Facebook by searching Time and Space Radio Show. Check out our free smartphone app and vote in the polls. Email us, timeandspace@live.com. And if what you have to say is interesting and intelligible, or so stupid and absurd that we just can't resist sharing it, you could be a winner. So break out your Bible, Quran, or Vedas and a map of the solar system. Crank up your headphones or speakers and grab some refreshments. Children are always welcome, and competent parental guidance is recommended. Language has been censored for offensiveness where possible, and if thinking outside the box bothers you, please pass this on to someone who can handle it. Ready? Look up.
Do you look in the sky a lot?
And calm down. You're finally listening to another episode of the world-famous, wildly popular Time and Space Radio Show. And now here's your host, Mike Smith.
So I will get to, a little bit of the formalities and chat towards the end of the interview, actually. I just had a couple of questions and comments for you, but as I say, we can just get right into it here. And I want to let you know that the show that we do does not necessarily discuss UFOs and ETs and everything all the time. And I did take note in your interviews that I've seen and some of the lectures that, that's not an issue that you consistently hit on. You've got a lot of other issues that you like to discuss and comment on. So we're certainly going to try to touch on a couple of those.
That's correct, yeah. It's important, but it's not primary.
Absolutely. I am, however, going to ask a couple of questions. It's mostly about the people more than anything else, but the first question that I wanted to go with was that it was interesting that when you first started to engage the subject of UFOs and ETs in or around 2005 or so, that in your time as Canadian Minister of Defense, you did comment that certain reports would occasionally cross your desk, some of them explainable and some of them maybe unexplained. I'm wondering if you could elaborate just a little bit on what types of reports you would see. Were these military reports from the Canadian Air Force, or what kind of material was this?
There were regular reports from the Air Force about sightings. And they included, as I have often said, about 80% that were identified as natural phenomena of one kind or another. But there were some that just had the simple word unexplained.
Right. Right.
And I guess those are the ones that we're most concerned about.
Now, does Canada, I'm sort of unfamiliar with this, does Canada have its own national space agency, or do they participate as partners with NASA, or
it
what
has
is...
a space agency, and it partners with the U.S. We have Canadian astronauts who have gone on missions with the U.S. astronauts, and who have also, I think, in one or two cases, served the period of time aboard the space station. So there's been a coordinated effort, but ours is really, small time compared to yours, as you can imagine.
Sure. Now, does the and we'll touch on this again in just a little bit, but does the sort of conclusion of the shuttle program, how does that impact Canada?
I think they're just really thinking about it now.
Yeah. Yeah.
I don't think they know the answer any more than maybe you do.
Right.
Although I think we both know that there are things going on that we haven't been told about that would be very fascinating, and whether they can ever get involved in those or not, only time will tell.
Sure. Yeah, I was going to get to that in just a second. The other thing, again, I'm just sort of touching on interviews that I've seen, with you. I wanted to ask about just a couple of the people that I know that you had met and interviewed. A couple of them I've met and interviewed as well, but a couple of them I have not. And I was really struck by sort of the names that you had dropped as far as who you sought out and who you were able to get in touch with and speak with. And the radio show that we do is really actually based on a book that I'm trying to write, which is mostly about the people that chase these subjects and explore and research these subjects. It really seems to me that in the past couple of decades there has been a transition, if you will, to taking the ET and UFO issue to another level, to taking it far more seriously than I think people had taken it back in the 50s and the 60s, even through Project Blue Book and things like that. The first name that I wanted to ask you about, just, a couple of comments is really all I was after. The first name I was really struck by that you mentioned was Travis Walton. I know he's really a kind of a famous name now in this sort of arena.
What's the name?
Yeah, it's Travis Walton.
Oh, yes, Travis.
Yeah, I was wondering if you could just comment on him and really the incredible story that he tells and his sincerity.
Yeah, he, of course, his name is well known in UFO circles, but he was recommended to me by a friend who, at least a person who has become a friend, retired United States Naval type who knew him well, and said if I would like to interview him, that he would set it up for me, because there was no problem in that. And also, he had discussed me with Travis, and Travis said he would be interested in talking to me. So when I was going to Las Vegas a few years ago to check out the presenters at a UFO crash conference there, I don't know why it's called crash conference, except the promoters are experts in the history of crashes. And so I took the opportunity to interview two people, and the first of them was Travis Walton. So I got in touch with him, and he and his wife graciously have agreed to go to Las Vegas and meet me there, because they don't live too far away in Arizona. So they came down, and we spent a lot of time over a 2-day period, talking, and me interviewing him and asking him questions and tape recording what he said and so on. And I was totally convinced that he was legitimate in telling the truth. And, the contact was not just formal when I was recording what he was saying, but also informal, sitting next to him at dinner,
sure,
that kind of thing, and asking questions that convinced me, this man is not making up this story. This is the truth. And he's had the same problem that a lot of people have who have been abducted or otherwise involved in contact with the alien technology or presence, and some people take him seriously and some don't. As he said, his family and friends were about equally divided between those who believed him and those who didn't.
Right.
He convinced me 100%, so I had no reluctance whatsoever to putting a very brief report of the interview in my book, which is, as you know, Light at the End of the Tunnel.
Yes.
Survival Plan for the Human Species. And although the book is not about UFOs, I put in a rather long chapter entitled "We Are Not Alone in the Cosmos" as a sort of primer for people who are either agnostics or not just in the dark totally, so that they could expose themselves to some of the things that I have learned in the last few years, and perhaps whet their appetite to learn more about the subject, which is very, very fascinating.
Absolutely. One of the other names that you mentioned, and this is a gentleman I have been fortunate enough to meet and to interview, I find his story equally fascinating, although it's not anything like Walton's, is Nick Pope from the former British Ministry of Defense. Can you just discuss briefly any discussions that you've had with Mr. Pope and what you think of him?
Well, first of all, he was one of many people who got in touch with me after I went public. He got my email address from somebody and sent me an email and said he would like to meet me if there was ever opportunity. And it just happened that I was going through London, England, where he lived at the time. I don't know whether he's moved to California since or not, but he was in London, England, and so I wired him and said that I would be passing through London en route to the Middle East to do a sort of a tour of discovery of that area, and how about lunch? And he readily agreed. We had a good discussion about his role in the Department of Defense, Ministry of Defense, as it's called in England, and he did not disclose things to me that were highly classified, but there were two cases that he handed me before we parted, and one of them was the Bentwaters case, which were already in the public domain.
Right.
And so it was as a result of Nick that I was able to get a long interview with Colonel Charles Halt.
Yes.
And it was one of the most revealing because it goes through the whole cycle of an agnostic, Colonel Halt saying to himself when after the second sightings and he was dispatched to find out about it, I'm going down to end this nonsense once and for all.
Right.
Coming away from it with his life changed totally. He hasn't been the same since. And then the disappearing papers and the people that would talk to him and wouldn't talk to him and lied to him, and all of these things that are associated with the cover-up in ufology and the cover-up of the United States involvement were all sort of in one story. So I put in quite a long section of his interview, and that was very authentic. When I saw Nick again in February in Arizona, he was another presenter there, and we had a chat, and he had his girlfriend with him, I think, who he married while he was down there. And so he's been one of sort of the people that I keep in touch with as to what's going on. And
sure.
And
now you mentioned that Pope had two cases that he had given you. And can I ask what the second one might have been?
The other one I didn't follow up.
Oh, okay.
Because I just was getting so much information, and so much time was involved because getting the interview from Colonel Halt involved
right.
An entire day after getting to Washington, and so I really had in that case all of the information of that sort that I really wanted.
Sure.
At this stage, I'm not really interested in following up on the other one because, as far as I'm concerned, there's no longer a question of proving the existence of UFOs and of the ET presence and technology. It's a question of getting the disclosure of what we do know, and then deciding how we're going to use that information constructively and for the benefit of people here on Earth and elsewhere, and not just use it destructively, which is a possibility that we can't ignore.
Right. Absolutely. And we were going to talk about that a little more in just a minute. First, just a couple other names, and I really am sort of leading to a question, sort of a general question, but I had been able to attach your name to some of these others. And again, I've met and interviewed a couple of these people. You've also dealt with Dr. Stephen Greer, Stephen Bassett of Paradigm Research Groups. Mr. Bassett was the one that actually put us in touch with you. I've interviewed Dr. Michael Sala. I know that Alfred Weber is another name of someone that you've met and talked to. And really, again, the point that there's been this sort of transition to a seriousness in this issue now. Who else would you maybe point to as a leader of this so-called exopolitics movement that maybe is really having an effect, being able to get out there and change people's minds about this?
Well, there are various people. All of the ones that you have mentioned are ones that I know, and of course some of them were involved in briefing me immediately after I went public. Stephen Greer, for example, was in Toronto, and he spent 3 hours giving me a briefing of what he knew, or just the surface of what he knew, which was very extensive, and he held nothing back, and it was a real revelation for me at that time. Since then, of course, it's just part of the picture. And Stephen Bassett and all of these others have contributed. To Weber, I actually did the one forward for a book he wrote on exopolitics before I was a believer. I was agnostic, but he was a friend and asked me if I would do it, and I wrote one which turned out to be a little bit prophetic in a way, mostly for me, I guess. The situation was unrolled, and I was on his show just recently, as a matter of fact. But other people, Linda Moulton Howe sought me out at a conference, I guess one in Las Vegas, and she is one of the best informed people in this business.
Absolutely.
And has access to sources which most people don't have access to. And she sent me a copy of her book, which I read from cover to cover very carefully. As you know, I did a dozen other books from other people, and all adding to my education. Well, then one that has been most cooperative with me and most helpful is Paula Harris.
Yes.
She, I think, is underrated because she has really been on the inside of some very important stories, including the day after Roswell with Philip Corso.
Mm-hmm.
She knew him well, interviewed him, and spent a lot of time with him, had his book translated into Italian and so on. And she has been very helpful to me in exposing me to various people that I have found interesting, and these included Charles Hall, who United States Airman who worked with the extraterrestrials on the U.S. bombing range in Nevada, and who told me about his experience with the tall whites. And he has incidentally written a book called Millennium Hospitality that anyone would be interested in reading if they would like to know about that particular species, and also about, what it's like for an airman to be frightened out of their wits working in an environment where all of a sudden they see these ghost-like creatures coming across the desert and not knowing what to do, where to hide, or whether to shoot at them or just climb under a bed somewhere or what. It's a fascinating story, but these are things that Paula opened up for me, and of course the latest one was the crash in 1945, 2 years before the crashes. I say crashes because I believe there were two in 1947 at Roswell, and so I talked as a result of her intervention. I talked to one of the people who had been a lad at the time and who had actually been at the site and observed all that was going on and was aware of the Army intervention and coming and asking to pick up the machine and take it away and all that sort of thing. So this is, Paula Harris has been both a friend and a strong supporter, but also of a great assistance to me in putting me in touch with people that have broadened my experience considerably.
I have to just quickly comment that I had the chance to meet Paula Harris a couple of years ago, and your description of her really fits with the person that I met and the way that I understood her interaction with some of the other people that she has dealt with. You mentioned a couple of them, and there are a couple of others we're going to bring up here in a little while. And it's really sort of her sincerity and her authenticity that seems to make her such a good researcher. It's just interesting to hear you really validate a lot of the other things I had been thinking after meeting her. And I'm sure she has been a great help to you. That's interesting to hear that.
She's absolutely first class, and I think she's underrated and should get more exposure than she does.
Right. Let me also finally touch on just one more sort of space question, if you will. A really interesting thing that I keep coming back to this. I had just read a couple of books on NASA recently, and I was sort of in that frame of mind already, and when I started researching for this interview, one 3-word phrase kept coming up, and I wanted to ask you about this. You had mentioned it in an interview with MSNBC and a couple of others, this incredible suggestion that possibly via the Bush administration, although now that story seems to have moved to a new chapter, that it's possible that NASA was intentionally devolving the shuttle missions and the shuttle program in order to create some sort of a military facility, or as you had called it, a forward moon base, aimed at curbing or helping to engage or defending against this extraterrestrial presence and the engagement of our planet. First of all, where did you come up with the information for such a claim?
Well, I was just quoting, first of all, going back and reading Corso.
Oh, yes. Okay.
In the Army plans, decades ago. And kept getting turned down by administration after administration. But then you never know when it was finally approved. President Bush was the first one that said publicly that it was going to be done. But whether it had already been done, or whether this was a future project, I don't know. It's just one more thing that we have to get if and when we finally get disclosure. The rumors are, and one shouldn't spread rumors, but the rumors are that the base already exists. Now, I don't know that, but I would be very, very interested in finding out from somebody that does.
Right.
Because I do sense, and when I say sense, the sense is based on common sense, that the United States has developed far more capacity in 60 years of back engineering than they have made public. When I say far more, so much more that it just boggles the mind.
Mm-hmm.
And some of these things that we've been doing and seeing with the shuttle and so on, to me, could even be in the category of diversion to sort of mold our minds as to the state of technology that currently exists as a cover for what really exists. And again, I can't say that with certainty because I'm not in the very small group of people who know the answers for sure. But that is my belief, because I know a little bit about how projects are developed and what can happen in 8 or 10 or 12 years. And I say to myself, what can happen in 60 years from the best minds working with tremendous information that they have gained from other sources, with the cooperation of some of the extraterrestrials of various species, at least 2, and expenditure of hundreds of billions of dollars. And some people even, put the estimates higher than that. At the conference in Nevada, for example, there was a presentation that claimed that $2 trillion had been spent over a long period of time. How much could be accomplished? And it just goes right off at the end of the belief scale. And so that's one of the reasons that I've been supporting Steve Bassett and others on their, and Stephen Greer and others for a long time now, saying that there must be full disclosure so that the American people know what they have got for the tax money they've spent and to what purpose it's being put. Is it going to be constructive and be beneficial to the American people and all mankind, or is it going to be used primarily for another excuse for the military industrial complex to keep on spending astronomical sums in order to kill somebody else?
Now, this brings up an interesting question, which is that I wonder, and I'm sure that other people have asked the question, but it's interesting, and you're doing it in this interview in the way that I've heard it done in many other interviews, that it seems to keep coming back to the United States. But I wonder who are the other players in this sort of a profound project. You've got the European Space Agency, the UK Space Agency, the Russians, of course the Chinese, and now the entire industry seems to be bringing in a commercial wing to it. Do you think the U.S. remains that kind of linchpin in this issue, or is continuing to run point on this issue, or is there more of a global, maybe, I don't know what to call them, community of people that are involved in this?
Well, I don't really know. I think that there are tremendous expenditures now being made in various parts of the globe, and probably a lot of duplication of effort because through lack of sharing of information. This is the way all arms buildups are carried out, as you know.
Right.
If somebody says we've got to be number one so that we can dominate the world, and we haven't yet evolved as a species to the point to say we have to be number one in seeking the cooperation of the world in order to build a better world, which is, I think, what most of us are hoping and praying for. So until we get that kind of world, we spend an inordinate part of our resources competing with each other, and in many cases just reinventing the wheel.
Mm-hmm.
And this, and we're talking about astronomical sums here, hundreds of billions of dollars. And when you start thinking of how many lives that could save of people who are starving or who don't have a shelter over their head or don't have a shirt in their back, what it could do, if it were put to useful purposes, is also mind-boggling. We could transform the world. And that is, in my opinion, what a lot of us would opt to do if we're given our choice. And but first, we've got to know exactly what the options are and what has been accomplished and how we could set up just a really different method of cooperation, which would make sense when we're dealing with something that is implicates the whole world. And our relationships with people from other worlds.
Now, this is where I would like to, and that's a great segue, because I'd like to move into a brief discussion here about the area that is basically what, for lack of a better word, might be called your wheelhouse, which is economics.
Right.
I am certainly not in any way an expert in the field, and honestly, I just, I hate to say it this way, but I mean, I'm just one of these people that kind of lives paycheck to paycheck and tries to, stay in my house and take care of my kids and live my life. But listening to you and listening to the way that you've been able to explain economics in some of the interviews that I've seen really, to me, was mind-boggling, because even while I did have maybe a faint understanding, to hear you say some of these things in such simple terms and so bluntly was really a bit of a shock. And I'll touch on a couple points and then ask you to please comment, because it really is some incredible stuff to think about. Is it really the case that banks were a manufactured creation? I believe that you've said a couple times, a couple of centuries back, that this was sort of something that was a system that was created by the powerful for the powerful. And am I understanding correctly that essentially what they did was that they took a small sum of money and then borrowed against it multiple times over to create this fantastic amount of wealth that has then been built into this, as you've said a couple times, this mind-boggling figure of trillions and trillions of dollars, not just in the United States, but in Europe and in other places. Am I understanding that correctly?
Well, more or less. Let me Let me first just give a simple example of how money is created, and then a little bit of history as to where we are, and then we can get maybe for a few minutes into the devastating consequences, especially in the United States, but also in the world. Most people think that when you go into the bank and borrow money, that you're borrowing money that somebody else deposited the day before. Now, that is the myth that the bankers would like you to believe. And so, as long as they can maintain that myth, they have total control. But what actually happens, if you were to go into your bank, you wanted to borrow $35,000 to buy a car, for example, and the bank will ask you, the friendly banker will ask you for collateral. Do you have any stocks or bonds? If not, do you have, could you give them a second mortgage on your house? Or failing that, do you have a rich mother-in-law or someone who would co-sign? And finally, when they're satisfied with the collateral, they will type their computer, and presto, $35,000 will appear in your account that you can go and spend to buy the car. Seconds earlier, that money did not exist. It was created out of thin air, so to speak. And the way that it works is they have a method of double accounting. I guess I left out that you have to sign a note for the $35,000, which is repayable with interest at a certain rate.
Okay.
Prime plus something or other.
Sure.
And so this money is created out of thin air. And the way they make their money, the note that you give them, they put on their books as an asset. And the money they create and deposit to your account is a liability, so that their books balance. And the way they make their money is that if you, for example, said to yourself, well, I don't think I'll spend the $35,000 right now because the new models are coming out in 3 or 4 months, and they're going to be better, so I'm going to wait. They would pay you 0 or maybe 0.25% or something interest on the $35,000 while you leave it in your account, while you're paying 10 times that or 20 times that on your note. And it's the difference between these two, which is called the spread, is where they make the money. So in effect, the more money they lend, whether it's to you or to governments or whoever, the more interest-bearing assets that they have, and the more money that they make. Now this is an old system, and it was originally called the partial reserve system, although it's called something else now. It's called the capital adequacy system. I won't try and explain these things, but
sure.
Let me go back to where I usually start this story, which was King William fighting a war against the King of France and running out of money to pay for his troops and his equipment that he needed. So someone said, why don't you get a bank chartered? And he did. And he got the rich people of London to put up £1,200,000 in gold and silver and lend it to him at 8%, which is a pretty high interest rate for a government guaranteed loan.
Sure.
Well, then the king said, or the government, probably the same thing in those days, to show my gratitude, I will allow you to print, P-R-I-N-T, an additional £1,200,000 in banknotes and lend them to your rich friends at high interest rates. So in effect, they were allowed to lend the same money twice, once to the government and once to their friends, and collect interest from both.
Incredible.
Now this is really a scam, and it had been perpetrated before that by the London goldsmiths, who did exactly the same thing. But the charter of when the Bank of England was chartered, it sort of legitimized the scam and made it legal. So over the years, that ratio, as we call it, that was a 2-to-1 ratio. You could lend the same money twice and collect interest from 2 different people. Over the years, that ratio has increased dramatically due to the avarice of the banks and the collusion of the politicians who were wise enough to buy bank shares and so on, and got donations from the banks at election time. And in the early days of the 20th century, in the United States, your federally chartered banks had to have a reserve of gold of 25%, which meant that the banks were allowed to lend the same money 4 times and collect interest from 4 different sources. In Canada, when I was young, the banks had to have a cash reserve of 8%, which meant that they were allowed to lend the same money 12.5 times and collect their interest from 12.5 different people. And then by the time the ideas of Milton Friedman and his colleagues from the University of Chicago had become the vogue, the ratio increased even more when the system was changed to this capital reserve thing rather than cash reserves. And by the time the failure came in 2007 and 8, banks were lending 20 times, and some New York banks as high as 30 times. So they were lending the same money to 30 different people and collecting interest from each one of them. Now, if you or I tried to do that, we'd be in jail tomorrow.
Yeah, and I heard you say this in another interview, and I really thought that I was not hearing you correctly. But now that you've said it again, that must have been the case. That's incredible.
Yeah, well, it's I don't know. I can't think of a word bad enough to think. I call it fraud in a speech I made in Arizona last February.
Right.
It's global fraud, and you can't get away with it in any other field. And I was talking about people who made scams and gone to jail for it, and the difference between them and the banks is that they operate outside the law, and the banks operate inside the law. Because for 2.5 centuries now, they have persuaded kings, queens, emperors, presidents, and prime ministers, and their congresses and parliaments to legalize this system of organized fraud. And that is the problem with the world today. And this is you have just gone through a wrenching, horrific ordeal in the United States over your debt limit. And so on. Well, this entire thing is a direct result of the system. Because if the system was right, there would be no such huge debt. But you have accumulated this debt because ever since the Federal Reserve System was established in 1913, you have been borrowing money from privately owned banks and paying interest on those bonds, even though you, the people, own the right to create the money. You own the right. You have the patent. It's yours. But somehow, the Congress allowed the private bankers to slip through this incredible piece of legislation 99 years ago, under which you gave the most valuable right of the American people to a group of private bankers. Now, that's exactly what it was. And I call it a heist, or however you want to say it.
Sure.
It's the biggest heist in the history of the world, and it's trillions and trillions of dollars that you, the people, now owe, which you didn't need to owe because you had the right to balance your budgets all that time by printing enough money to do it. And so now, either we're going to allow this banking cartel, which is international, we're going to allow them to destroy Western civilization, which is the way it's headed, because you look at the United States and, you can increase the debt limit today, but if all the money is created as debt, you don't have to be a genius to see that you're going to have to raise it again in a couple of years, and then again and again and again, until eventually you either have a revolution or people get so tired of paying interest that they just default and the whole world economic system collapses.
Right.
And so that is the direction in which we are headed, and that is the reason I'm getting so passionate about it.
Right.
Because it doesn't need to happen. And you don't have to have high unemployment. And you don't have to have infrastructure crumbling that should be replaced and so on. And as you know from what you I'm sure have discerned from my other speeches and so on, there's an even larger issue, and that is global warming. And our leaders should be addressing that, and they're totally ignoring it, partly at least because they haven't got any money to pay it for doing anything about it. And they've got to change the monetary system, which is the most urgent problem in the world, in order to solve the most important problem, which is
the other
global
problem.
warming. Yeah. And it isn't being done because, like you say, even the congressmen are more interested in getting their paychecks and doing their ordinary things and answering their correspondence than they are in figuring out how the system works and how they ever got into this horrible mess.
Let me do a quick reset here. First of all, my name is Mike Smith, and I'm the host of the show. The show is called Time and Space. You can visit us at timeandspace.us. We are speaking today with the Honorable Paul Hellyer, former Minister of Defense of Canada and author of the book Light at the End of the Tunnel, A Survival Plan for the Human Species. Many of the things that you've just discussed, especially about economics and even global warming, you discuss in the book. And I have heard several times my co-host today, Mike Fay, trying to chime in here because I know he's got a couple of questions. So, Mike, please take over and go ahead.
Hi. I'm just listening to explain the financial system, and I'm just sitting here shaking my head. But I guess my question is, what would happen if there was the equivalent of like a margin call on the banks? If there was a run on the banks and everybody went to the bank to get their money, so 1 out of 10 people would get their money?
Less than that. With ratios of 20 to 1, only 1 out of 20 people.
So this is why it says effect, I'm sorry, go ahead.
In effect, no one would get it, really. Well, other than the first few people who walk through the door. Because it doesn't exist.
Incredible.
Right. It's all just hot air. That's all it is. It's a Ponzi scheme. It's a house of cards, and it only operates on faith because in the normal course of the day, all three of us don't go into the bank to take our money out. Maybe one of us would go in and take out a few bucks for the weekend or something, but normally we don't take it out, and in other words, we don't call. Mm-hmm. And if we all went in and called, as you say, the whole system would crumble instantly. What they do, of course, what they did to try and successfully end that or prevent it, the last meltdown, was that the Fed created more than $2 trillion to bail out the banks, the banking system, a few large corporations. And they managed to successfully keep them from going bankrupt. But they didn't create $2 trillion for the people or the government. So the government was left in the terrible position of still having to go back to the same banks that were really technically bankrupt and borrow more money from them in order to keep operating.
Right, and then we printed more money so we could buy that debt back.
Yeah, well, more money that you can just afford debt to spend because you're over budget on these military projects and other things, when in effect you have the power to create some or all of the money. Some of monetary reformers think that the government should print 100% of the money, and I understand where they're coming from. I would make a case that if even part of it was created by the government, that the system would work. And in my book, I'm recommending 34%, which would be enough for governments to balance their budgets at all levels, the federal level, the state level, and the municipal level, and have enough money for infrastructure and for a good fast fight against global warming without high taxes. And it is possible, but nobody yet is doing it, although there's a precedent for it in the Guernsey Islands, if anybody ever wants to look at it.
So the Fed in the United States, is there an equivalent of that in other countries? Do other countries have anything equivalent to the Fed where the banks basically the government is beholden to the banks that are part of the Fed?
You have a sort of a double question there. There's nothing as complicated as the Fed.
Okay. I've been trying to figure out the Fed for the last 2 years, so.
So if you want complication, why just look at the Fed and the 12 different Federal Reserve banks all operating in concert to promote the interests of the private banks and skim the people. But there are central banks in nearly all countries, except now in Europe, where they have the euro, the money creation, or the bank of last resort, as it is called, acts for all of the European Union. We have one in Canada. The difference is ours is publicly owned. So theoretically, it should be producing money for the use of the Canadian government at zero or interest rates or something like that, close to it. And they did that from 1939 to 1974. But then in 1974, the Bank for International Settlements, which is run by the half dozen most powerful central banks in the world, adopted the ideas of Milton Friedman, and they managed to persuade central banks like the Canadian Bank not to produce any more cheap money for government. In other words, not to pay any attention to their shareholders, but to act in the interests of the global monetary cartel. And that was something that hasn't been recognized in Canada, and I'm trying to draw attention to it. It's very difficult because the bankers work in concert. They spend millions trying to get the economics profession in their corner. I think the Federal Reserve System spent $380 million last year on contracts to various organizations and individuals to do studies for them and so on, presumably to get at the truth, but in effect to have them on side so that they wouldn't start questioning the system and how it works.
And where does the IMF fit in to this whole thing?
Find us on the internet, timeandspace.us. And don't forget, download our free smartphone app.
Do you look in the sky a lot?
You're listening to Time and Space on 22nd Century Radio.
Soccer Post DC is where the big box ends and service and expertise begin. Find the soccer gear you need from Nike, Under Armour, Adidas, and Diadora. Located on Route 50 in Chantilly, Virginia at the Greenbrier Shopping Plaza. Soccer Post DC, 703-817-1110. Open 7 days a week. Visit soccerpostdc.com and find them on Facebook. Exclusive supplier to Herndon Travel and the George Mason University Patriots. Soccer Post DC.